Is the war in Syria really almost over? Syria's president visits Russia to thank his allies for their sacrifices. They say victory is close and are talking about a political solution. How likely is that with a badly divided opposition and rebel areas still bombarded by airstrikes? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Laura Kyle. Welcome to the programme. He's thanked them for their sacrifices and for saving his country. Syria's President Bashar al Assad has flown to Russia for a few hours to meet his major ally, Vladimir Putin. The Kremlin says Russia's president told him that the fight against armed groups is close to finishing. And once it's over, finding a peaceful political settlement will be key. Is that achievable? The opposition has long demanded a future Syria without Assad, but he's survived nearly 7 years of war and is likely to remain in charge for the foreseeable future.
We just had a meeting with President Vladimir Putin, and I passed greetings and gratitude to him and to the people of Russia for the efforts which Russia put in saving our country. I particularly emphasized the role of the Russian armed forces and the sacrifices you have made to reach this goal. Thanks to your efforts and the efforts of our allies, many Syrians could return to their homes. And I would like to express gratitude to you for what you have done on behalf of all the Syrian people.
President Assad knows, and he told me during our talks, that thanks to the efforts of the Russian army, Syria is saved as a state. Much has been done to stabilize the situation in Syria, and I hope in the near future we will put a final stop to fighting terrorism in Syria.
Let's take a look at who controls what in Syria right now. Government forces and their Russian allies have had the momentum on the ground for the past year. They now control more than 50% of territories seen here in red, including Syria's 4 largest cities. The rebel areas are in green. Iraqi militia allied to the Syrian regime made gains into ISIL territory in the east, shown here in black. And much of the north is in the hands of US-backed Kurdish forces, shown here in yellow. They're seeking to establish an independent region. Let's bring in our panel now. We're joined here in Doha by Marwan, Kabalan, Director of Policy Analysis at the Doha Institute. And in Moscow, we're joined by Pavel Felgenhaeur, Russian foreign policy specialist and columnist for Novaya Gazeta. Welcome, all of you. Thanks very much for joining us here on Inside Story. Pavel, this is only the second time, isn't it, that Bashar al Assad has left Syria since the war began in 2011. Why is he in Moscow now? Does this mark a crucial turning point in the war?
Well, it was actually not Moscow, but Sochi, which is a de facto Russian second capital, and Putin spends almost half the year there, and now he has right now gathered all his military top brass and military industry top brass, and he introduced Bashar al Assad to them. And it's also important, maybe interesting to notice that most likely Bashar al Assad overflew to Sochi over Turkish territory on a Russian military plane. Before that, Turkey was not allowing Russian transit flights from the Sochi area to Khmeimim base, but now it does. So most likely he was overflying Turkish territory. So yes, it's important for Russia to demonstrate to the Russian public, there's an election coming up next March, a presidential election, that Russia is victorious, Putin is again victorious, the war in Syria is almost over, mission accomplished.
So it plays well on the domestic front in Russia as well. Marwan, do we generally accept now, is there an acceptance that Russia is firmly in the driving seat when it comes to finding a solution to the Syria issue?
Yeah, I guess it is. And in fact, Bashar al-Assad was actually called to Sochi ahead of an important summit that's going to take place tomorrow for the heads of the 3 key players in the Syrian conflict, i.e. Russia, Turkey and Iran. Having Russia actually hosting this meeting, very important meeting in my opinion, means that Russia is the de facto power broker in Syria. Don't forget that the United States actually has already accepted that Russia is calling the shot, and Russia is leading the political, the supposed, political solution in this country. But before that, I wanted actually to draw the attention to this picture, which in fact summarizes the 7 years of conflict in Syria, or the outcome of 7 years of conflict in Syria. Yesterday, the head of the opposition resigned actually ahead of a major opposition conference in Riyadh, whereas the head of the Syrian regime actually is in Moscow thanking his big ally for saving the country. This summarizes, in my opinion, the outcome of the conflict in Syria, which is a very important thing for me to watch, actually.
Okay, we're just pleased to say that we've now got our third guest joining us from London, Ammar Waqqaf. He is a member of the British Syrian Society. Welcome, Ammar, to the discussion. Marwan was just talking there about Riad Hijab having just resigned from the HNC. We wanted to bring you a little bit about what he said, because it was on Monday that this head of the main Saudi-backed Syrian opposition group, that's the High Negotiations Committee, resigned, along with main other figures. Now, he didn't explain why exactly he was quitting, but he did post this statement online. So let's just read that. After close to 2 years of hard work to preserve the glorious principles of the Syrian revolution, I find myself forced to announce my resignation from the HNC, wishing it good luck and wishing peace and security to my beloved country, Syria. I mean, this is a crucial talking point, isn't it, today in our discussion? And Ammar, what do you see is behind Riad Hijab's resignation?
The main point here was that, as we understand, was that they were not really invited to the conference in Riyadh, the Riyadh 2 conference. And the reason behind that was apparently that they were known to be an obstacle to adopting a new kind of, say, route towards a different sort of engagement for the Syrian opposition with the peace process in Syria, or the political settlement in Syria. They were understood to have said, no, we will stick with, for example, wanting to get rid of President Assad, wanting to dismantle the security apparatus, the numerous ones, and so on and so forth, basically to dismantle the regime. And apparently there is a new tendency now in Riyadh to enlarge the body that is under the Saudi umbrella, and that would mean getting some new ideas and compromising a little bit with other bodies like the Cairo, for example, platform, and the Moscow platform, in order to engage with what has become a reality, which is that President Assad is staying in place, and one could argue for a longer time than previously perceived.
Marwan, what is this new route? Is it solely that Assad now has a place beyond the end of the military conflict, whether it's transitional or more permanent? We don't know yet. But is that generally the main gist of the new opposition's
Well, I think this
route?
is what the Russians are hoping for, in fact. If you look at the joint statement by the US president and the Russian president on the side of the APEC summit in Vietnam last week, actually, it did not mention any political transition in Syria. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, actually, they were talking about issues that maybe the Russians are willing to arrange in Syria, like, for example, having a constitution, although, I mean, nobody still know what sort of constitution we are going to have in Syria, because this is a major point of contention between the regime and the opposition. And that is something that the conference for the opposition in Riyadh tomorrow must address. They are talking about either having the 2012 constitution, which was in fact written by the regime itself with few modifications, or going back to the 1950 constitution, Syrian constitution, which was actually drafted like 60 years ago. Number two is the elections, but there is also no no talk about what sort of elections that we are going to have. Is it parliamentary elections or presidential elections? These are two important things. But in brief, the Russians are having their way. It seems that the Russians are having their way in Syria, but without, I mean, we shouldn't be very optimistic about them succeeding, because a huge part of Syria is still actually outside the control of the Syrian regime. 1/3 of the country. This is, in my opinion, the most important 1/3 of the country, which means the Syrian Al Jazeera on the north and south part of the country, which is most of Syria's gas, oil reserve, water reserve also is actually located in that region. And in my opinion, the rest of the country cannot survive without that part. If that part remains under the control of the Syrian Democratic Forces, i.e. the Kurdish forces, that means actually the conflict in Syria is going to last for much longer than people are actually talking about.
I mean, you brought in a lot of huge points, which hopefully we can revisit a little later in the discussion. I just want to ask you one more question for the moment on the conference tomorrow that's being held in Riyadh. Lots of different opposition groups, as we've heard, being brought together. Do you think that there will come out of that a single united opposition voice that doesn't involve Assad stepping down?
I think there are three major groups, actually, not many, but three major groups: the Moscow, the Riyadh, and the Cairo opposition groups. They are meeting specifically for this purpose, to agree on a common ground for the whole opposition in order to be able to go in one joint delegation, to go to Geneva and to start this negotiations with the regime. There is a huge pressure on all of them, actually, including from Saudi Arabia, from Egypt, and from the three major players here that we are having. Saudi Arabia, which actually have leverage over the Riyadh opposition group, Cairo, which has leverage over the Cairo, Egypt, which has leverage over the Cairo group, and Moscow, actually, which is very much seeking right now to have this sort of new delegation, joint delegation, to represent the Syrian, because without that you can't have a political process starting actually within the Geneva process. So there is going to be huge pressure on these different groups in order to agree on a one common ground to start or to kick off this the Geneva process.
Pavel, would you broadly agree with that? There is a Russia delegation going to this conference in Saudi on Wednesday. Is there huge pressure being placed on the opposition to fall in line?
Well, those that are gathering in Riyadh, they are, of course, not those who are that part of the opposition that's more or less close to Moscow, but it's right. The Russian delegation and the special representative Vladimir Putin is going there and will be speaking there. It demonstrates the new kind of equilibrium in the Middle East, where Russia is trying very hard to broaden its alliances and not to be just kind of appendix to the Shia Iranian-led part, but also to have good connections with Sunni major powers, with Saudi Arabia, with Turkey, with Egypt. And Russia would want to be the kind of country that's kind of balancing the situation in the Middle East, which talks to everyone, has good relations with everyone, including Israel, and that will make Russia indispensable power in finding a kind of new status quo in the Middle East. And of course, Russia has very specific military targets in the Syrian conflict, and that's the establishment and further keeping the military bases, the Tartus naval base that's being expanded, and even more importantly, the Khmeimim air base, which is on the Mediterranean coast and which will provide support and cover to the Russian Mediterranean flotilla.
So that explains why Russia is so keen to be such a key player in this process. Ammar, just going back to Marwan's point, and I'm wondering whether you agree with it, whether there are still huge parts of Syria that are not represented at the diplomatic front and will be obstacles to this process, whether you want to call it the Geneva process or the Astana process, but they don't feel that they're represented.
Well, this is, in a sense, phase 2 of the problem or the Syrian crisis. If we could summarize what happened in the past 7 years as phase 1, which is coming to an end, i.e. part of the Syrian people taking up arms against the government. That's, you know, ending up now as we speak. The second phase would be to reunite the country under a central government once more. And obviously there are certain groups who disagree whether it should be a central government or a federal system. And they have allies. The United States is definitely giving or providing a huge cover to the Kurds in terms of getting as much playing cards, as much under their belt to trade with the government. They have the oil fields, they have a lot of huge swaths of the Syrian plateau where there are lots of resources, oil, water, gas, cotton, wheat, whatever. So there will be some trading, but we don't think that this is going to turn into an armed conflict, so to speak. These people are still Syrians. Their opinions will most probably be taken into consideration as long as they don't go, you know, offshoot with whatever dreams they have. Or somebody might say, well, if you go tough with Damascus, then probably it would be at a later stage when they would join the political process. The political process is still in its infancy, really. We're still getting the main body of the opposition to accept defeat, so to speak, in their attempts to overthrow the government. And let's see what happens in Riyadh. There is no guarantee whatsoever that it's going to be a successful conference, even though the hardliners or the hawks have resigned.
And that's an interesting turn of phrase that you're using there, hardliner or hawk. I mean, that's only recently come into the conversation, that if someone is insisting that Assad go, they are seen as an obstacle.
Well, in a sense, there are those in the Syrian opposition who cannot envisage sharing power or at least having to deal with any part of governance whilst President Assad is there. They forget, in a sense, let's just call them the hawks for a moment, they forget that there are quite a few Syrians who believe that the government is actually protecting them. And actually, in fact, the majority of Syrians who are currently inside Syria feel as such. And to convince those that President Assad shouldn't be there is going to be a very huge task. And I think that's where practicality comes, and that's where the regional powers and the international powers have realized, who originally backed the opposition and still do, have realized that it would be very hard to just force President Assad out. They've tried everything they could and it didn't happen. And to convince the Syrians inside Syria, who happen to be the only ones who are definitely going to, for the moment at least, definitely going to participate in any upcoming election, it's going to be very hard. So off with those who believe that the Syrian government is going to be dismantled and President Assad must go, and let's bring those who are more pragmatic and can live with it, so to speak.
Marwan, what happens to those people who still believe that Assad must go?
No, I think before that, there are 2 points here. Number one is that, in my opinion, the opposition has not been offered a share in power by the regime. Otherwise, the whole conflict shouldn't have started from the very beginning. Number two, I can't accept the statement that one party in Syria has been defeated and another party has won. I think all Syrians actually have been defeated in this conflict. Don't forget that half of the Syrian population are displaced now, whether internally or externally. The country is very much divided, is de facto division now, because we have been talking over the past few minutes about the Kurdish and the opposition and the regime controlling different parts of the country. More than 60% of the infrastructure has been destroyed. We don't have control over our fate as Syrians. We are being controlled actually either by the Russians, the Iranians, the Turks, the Saudis. Every single country maybe in the world is having a bit of control over Syrian sovereignty and control. So I do not see that a Syrian winner in this conflict. This is why I believe that opposition and regime must come to the conclusion that maybe it's time now for national reconciliation and for the Syrian people to decide who is going to run the country in the next phase.
Pavel, what Marwan says is absolutely right, isn't it? Because let's look at the other important meeting that's on Wednesday, and this is a meeting between Russia, Iran and Turkey. Interesting enough that Turkey's being brought to that table, but also, where are the Syrians there in that meeting? I mean, this is once again outside forces talking about Syria without Syria present.
Oh, that's how it's most likely going to be, because the internal Syrian civil war, if not ended, but it's kind of reached a big turning point. And now it's going to be even more, most likely, internationalized as the ISIS has been eliminated, at least as a quasi-state, and is back into being some kind of terrorist organization. But there are the outside forces. There's reports of Turkish armor and troops moving in to Idlib province additionally, and moving up to the Afrin enclave occupied by the Kurds. There'll be a conflict there, possibly. Israel has announced that it will not tolerate Iranian or Hezbollah bases being established in Syria, and can go to war over that, with all due respect, between Netanyahu and Putin. And there are the Saudis, who are right now very much opposed to Iranian also presence in Lebanon, the Hezbollah and the Iranians in Syria. So there's the outside powers that didn't go away. And now, since the common enemy of everyone, ISIS, is more or less out of the picture as a big force, these forces are going to be kind of going at each other, with each having their own agenda.
And Ammar, why have we been seeing these U-turns from these outside powers? I'm thinking of Saudi Arabia, I'm thinking of Turkey, even Qatar. They are no longer demanding Assad steps down, and they seem to be falling into line with Russia.
I think the Russian intervention in Syria changed the formulae in a sense. Everybody now is being more pragmatic, and the whole of the point is that there is a conflict that I have invested a lot of resources into for the reason of gaining some influence, for gaining whatever it is. And it's going to slip out of my hand if I don't do anything, if I don't change my position, if I don't become a little bit more pragmatic. So they're keeping themselves in a game as such. The Saudis definitely. The Turkish position is slightly different, because they have been sort of forced either into a direct confrontation with Russia, which was likely to be the case 2 years exactly from now, or get in line with Russia and do something about it, and actually gain or mitigate the risk of establishing, for example, a Kurdish state in north and northeastern Syria. So they benefited somehow from aligning themselves with Russia on that specific note. Qatar, it's probably because of the problems in the Gulf. They need some sort of an insurance card, in a sense, against whatever the Saudis would like to have. And so it is, for different reasons, different players have shifted positions slightly in order to stay in the game.
And Marwan, what does that mean for the US position? What role is left for the US to play now?
Not much, actually, especially after the defeat of ISIL in Syria. The major US interest, actually, in Syria and in the entire region was the war against ISIL. And since ISIL has been defeated in both Iraq and Syria, we don't see much of a US role here. But of course, I mean, the Russians would want, actually, the US to also fall in line and to support their effort in order to, to end this conflict. But as I said, before, the US seems to have accepted that the Russians are actually the major power broker here in Syria, and the Syrian question has been most of it has been left to the Russians. But I think the Americans will be trying over the next phase of this conflict to influence somehow the course of events concerning the political solution, i.e. not allowing the opposition to be entirely defeated and a political settlement imposed upon them by Russia, which actually leaves them nothing after 7 years of conflict.
So 2 big meetings to watch this week. We will leave the discussion there for now, though. Thank you very much to all our guests for joining us. Marwan Kabalan, Pavel Felgenhaeur and Ammar Waqqaf. And thank you too very much for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.